I curate quilts. I study their patterns, their fabrics, and their histories to tell the story of Maine from the perspective of their makers, who were mostly middle-class women. So when a quilter friend asked if I would make a miniature reproduction quilt for the Pine Tree Quilt Guild's Maine Quilt Show, I said sure, but I was forgetting one thing. I'd never made a quilt. And my first ever quilt would have to hold its own in a statewide show among quilts like this made by women who've been doing this for years. And so like this quilt, my finished wee quilt would be on display beside its full-size antique inspiration. So planning, okay, plan A. I figured a wool quilt would be the most forgiving for a newbie, and this Maine State Museum example is one of my favorites, but it has 584 pieces, and at the smaller scale, some would be less than 1 inch across. So I played with a pattern, and plan B had only 436 pieces, but the size problem remained. So on to plan C, also from the State Museum. 14 pieces is right up my alley. So I hired Attic Heirlooms in Damascotta to dye the wool for the front, and the original quilt back was made from old blankets, and I haunted antique shops, but nobody had ratty blankets, and I wasn't going to cut up a good one. So I found some new gray wool twill for backing, and I overdyed it blue. And the bonus is that it was a thinner fabric than the old blanket, so it was going to be easier to quilt through. And so, as you may guess by now, this isn't really a how to quilt talk. It's a how I winged it making a repro quilt talk, which brings me to surface treatment. Okay, calendaring. The surface of the original quilt was smoothed by calendaring, which is running the damp fabric through heavy, hot rollers and applying a glaze made with egg whites. It turns out that dry cleaners can simulate calendaring, but they can't glaze fabric. And after many tests, I decided against it too, because life's just too short. So while I waited for the wool to be dyed, I worked on the quilting design. Based on photos I took of the antique quilt, I traced the fabric, the flower patterns, and anchored them to a tree of life motif. The original had just vines and flowers, but the tree of life was a really popular visual theme in the day, about 200 years ago, and it's a favorite of mine. To get started, I drew up an 8 by 10 inch schematic and then a full-size layout. And I added several flowers to fill up the blank spots, and I designed a bird and a butterfly that also helped fill gaps, because what's a tree of life design without bugs and birds? So finally, we are now almost on slide 9 of 20, and I pick up my needle for the first time in this whole process. So like the original, my wee quilt was completely hand-stitched. It took a couple months longer than I anticipated for me to get the dyed fabric, so thank heaven there were only 14 pieces, or I never would have made it. Never. So like the maker of the antique quilt, I used wool batting, and batting is the in-between layer that gives quilt its loft. And unlike the original quilter, I didn't have to card it from raw wool. I bought my wool batting in a bag, and all I had to do was split it in half. So that was a real time saver, not to mention less smelly. So I made a wool sandwich, which was fabric, batting, and then more fabric. And then once I pinned it and basted it with loose stitches, my quilt was ready to mark for quilting. Now, if I'd known what I was doing, I would have given myself some wiggle room on the sides, because I didn't leave any room for mistakes, which was a little scary once I got going. So, rather than using powdered chalk to mark my quilting lines, as the quilt maker of my quilt might have done, I thought I'd use the specialized felt tip pens they have today. But nobody could tell me if they'd work on wool the way they'd work on cotton, so I had to test them. So after 48 hours, the lines were still clear, and then when I spritzed them with water, they vanished. So success! And my quilter friends told me to start in the middle and quilt my way to the edges to keep distortion at a minimum. So I drew each motif of the quilting pattern as I was ready to stitch it, and I checked it up against my mock-up to be sure I had it in the right place, and only one motif wound up upside down, and I'm not telling you which. Okay, we're on slide 14 of 20, and the prep work is complete, and I'm finally quilting. And Mom lent me her spare lap quilting frame, which you can see on the edge on the far other side there. And it's essentially a giant embroidery hoop, so thanks, Mom. And I made several photocopies of every quilting pattern because I transferred the design to the quilt by cutting away the bits of each floral motif and tracing around what was left until the motif was complete. And there may be an easier way to do this, but I have no idea what that would be. So I've been dreading the quilting part, all that hand stitching, but it was quick work and very meditative. You have to focus, but you can't focus too intently. I thought about going back and adding another series of diagonal lines to the background if I had the time, and it turned out I had the time, but I apparently lacked the attention span because I still haven't done it. So I'm ready for the edges. The center medallion is quilted. I've pulled the basting in that area, and I'm ready for the perimeter. Now the marking pens don't show up against the indigo blue. Luckily for me, white marking chalk now comes in 0.7 millimeter pencil form. So while the white chalk lines are visible in the top part of the indigo border in that picture. Here's the same motif before and after quilting, just for fun. Now to finish the quilt, I stitched a 1/2 inch from the outer edge all the way around, which is, you can see at the bottom there. It's a technique I've seen on British quilts from around 1800. So when I told this to my quilting friends, they all assured me that that's the hard way to finish a quilt. So oops. But I trimmed the extra batting back to that line I just sewn, and I tidied up the fabric edges and turned them inwards. And it turned out that tricky line was a great way to help. It really helped this person, this newbie here. And it kept my border nice and even, and it gave the quilt a tidy edge. And at the very last, I quilted my name and the date. So done. I pulled it off. So now, thank you. So now I'm back at my more familiar work, which is researching 250 years of quilts to tell the story of Maine through the work of women's hands, just in time for the state's bicentennial. So come by the State Museum in 2020 and check it out. Thank you.